Welcome. Today we are here to demonstrate how the account provisioning flow works behind the scenes in UBIX. The first thing that we'll be doing here is accessing the Customers tab under the User menu. First, navigate to Customers. Then we can see the list of customers that we have already triggered in this environment. We're going to add a new customer. Here we need to select which virtual private cloud we are going to use in this case, if it's either AWS or GCP. For this, we're going with AWS, and the pricing structure basically represents the structure of the account. If it's going to be multi-tenant or if it's going to be a single tenant mode, which we call the UBIX pricing structure, then we can select the contract terms. We can fill in all the necessary information here. Once we have everything in place, we can save all the info, and then this new customer will be created in our databases. If we check here, we have Mr. UBIX in a deployment initiated state. We have 3 steps that we execute. The first one will be to create the customer account, and we know we're going to provision the cloud resources for it and check if everything is ready and up and running. Now that we have this customer created, it will be triggering a new message to one of the queues. From this message, it contains all the necessary info related to this customer that we are going to provision. We start with the name of the cloud resources that we're going to create for that specific new account, so we can track everything that's going behind the scenes. We can check here the execution of the job. You'll see the port is initializing to start the process. Now that it's running, we can track the logs. Basically, this job is split into 2 different parts. The first one will be to create the child account manifest that's related to the composition, a snapshot of the composition that represents a set of cloud resources that is meant for this customer. We are going to create the account itself and to create all the cloud resources into that specific account. There will be a new dedicated DKS cluster, a new dedicated VPC, route tables, internet gateways, net gateways, and all the necessary cloud resources for this specific type of structure. We are using Crossplane behind the scenes. You'll see it's checking for the status of this specific child account. We have some info that is displayed here as the account name, the cluster endpoint, which is the EKS endpoint, the VPC ID, the certificate that we'll be using for the applications, the cluster name, and so on. Once this process finishes, we move to the second part, which is meant for the deployment applications. Considering we have the EKS cluster up and running, we're going to use Argo to deploy all the necessary applications that will be hosted by this cluster. So there will be dedicated applications like front-end BFS and all the data tooling that we use as a base for the UBIX solution. This is an ongoing process, but we can also check all the resources that are being provisioned at this time here in Argo. If we check, we'll see it is still syncing the manifest in the cluster. Here we can check, for example, the creation of the VPC. We have the net gateway, the internet gateway, the elastic IP, and the cluster itself. Once everything is up and running, we're going to have this application synced. We're going to wait a little bit for this process to finish so we can proceed to the next step. One of the things that we do here is to keep watching for those resources, so we have a timeout configured. But the Argo workflows, which is responsible for the execution of this job, will be retrying several times, looking for the current state and the desired state. And once those are equal, we're going to proceed to the next step. We could be provisioning the retrial about the timeout here. So let's grab the new pod. It's initializing and running. Now it will be rechecking for the status of the account. We can see we already have the account name in place, the VPC ID, which is already created inside that account. We already have the certificate, the Route 53 zone, and the other resources are still pending to be created. The state is updated, and we can see the cluster endpoint. The cluster name should be completed within some minutes. Now the cloud resources are ready. If you see here, it's ready and synced. And now we're starting the second part of the process where we're going to create the applications in the cluster we have provisioned. It will be sending a new PR to one of our repositories and GitHub that will be serving the manifest to be created into that based on Argo. In Argo, we have a lot of charts that will be read in this specific repository and will be deploying using the GitOps approach. It'll be sending a new PR to our repo regarding this specific customer. If you go to the Argo page, we can see all the resources that have been provisioned. We are going to filter by this new cluster, and you will see all the applications that are being created into the new cluster. We can see here we have some applications missing to be deployed. Some of them are already healthy, and some others are still progressing to be deployed. We are going to wait for this process to finish. It's all automatic. We use Crossplane to create automatically and reconcile all the status and the state of the cloud resources. And we do the same for the applications, but instead of using Crossplane, which is more related to the infrastructure, we're going to use Argo to deploy and keep reconciling the state of each application that we run into this dedicated account. If we move here to the job again, it will be checking the health of the applications. And it's going to follow the same procedure that I mentioned earlier. The job will have a timeout configured, and it will be launching new pods for checking the state of the deployment process. If it fails, it will be relaunching new pods just to make sure that everything is okay. If the desired state is equal to the current state, then the process will finish. It takes some time for everything to be synced because some of the applications have dependencies with others. There are several configurations that we need to correlate between one application and others. Regarding the databases, we use Postgres operator to serve the databases inside the cluster directly. We have data tooling apps that need to be provisioned. So the back for front-end applications keeps in a synced and in a stable place. It takes a while until we get to this point. So we are going to wait a little bit just to see the final result. If we navigate back to the Customers tab, it's still in deployment initiated. It will be changing to say that the resources were provisioned successfully when the job finishes, and it will be sending the credentials to the customer. Once this customer logs in for the first time, the customer will be active. It received a timeout, so it will be launching a new pod to check the state. Now we can see that the process has completed. We can see all the data that relates to this customer here. We have the name of the account, the identification of this customer in the UBIX platform, the cluster endpoint, and so on for all the other cloud resources. When we refresh the page, we can see that for Mr. UBIX, the credentials have been sent now. We created the customer account, we provisioned the resources, and the customer is not active yet because we need the admin to log in for the first time. So if we come here to the email, I have received a welcome email from UBIX. We have the credentials for this specific customer and the temporary password. And it says that it's an administrator role for this user. So now let's log out from my current user. We are going to type these new credentials for this new account. Let's change the temporary password. We can see we have successfully updated the password. We can see all the applications that we have dedicated for the single tenant account. It's worth mentioning here that we can go to model space and it will open the URL that is meant for that model space. For every new customer, we have dedicated URLs that will be pointing to the dedicated applications that are running within the cluster that is placed in a specific VPC. So the same will happen for solution space as well, and that's how account provisioning works behind the scenes with UBIX. Thanks for watching.